Back with author J.D. Vance, and we're talking a little in depth about the immigration issue. Now, recently, Nancy Pelosi made a very interesting statement about how the illegals and the dreamers are sort of the true embodiments of the American dream. Listen.
This legislation is protecting dreamers and TPS and DED recipients, honors the truth that immigrants are the constant reinvigoration of our country. When they come here with their hopes and dreams and aspirations, these parents bringing their children, their hopes and dreams and aspirations for a better future for their children, that courage, that determination, those aspirations are American traits, and they all make America more American with all of that. Indeed, they are true and legitimate heirs, these dreamers are, of our founders. E pluribus unum from many one. We talk about that all the time.
Now, when Nancy Pelosi uses this rhetoric, and you can imagine, JD, it resonates with me because, of course, I came to America for this American dream. I was, in a sense, dreaming the dream before I even got here. But she's not referring to me. She's referring to a different type of immigrant. And so that's the sort of that's the underlying message that is not part of what she's saying. I want to talk about a very eye-opening op-ed that you just wrote. This was in Newsweek about illegal immigration, and you started it by talking about you and your wife, who I believe is Indian American by background. But anyway, you were talking about the two of you were at what you call a Master of the Universe event. An event with all these social elites and business elites. Tell us a little bit about this event and what you heard there that caused your ears and your wife's ears to perk up.
Sure. Well, as you know, Dinesh, these events are pretty common. We call them cocktail parties, they're dinners, they're resort functions where everybody goes to the same fancy hotel and really sort of celebrate how in control and how wealthy they are in our entire society. It's a pretty fascinating dynamic. But at this one in particular, this was in 2018, I believe, I was seated next to my wife, of course, and also to a large hotel multinational CEO. And he was talking about how he had to raise wages because of Donald Trump's immigration policies. And I was sort of like, oh, that's an interesting comment. Let's talk a little bit more about that. He said, look, in the past, if I needed more laborers in my hotel, then I could just go to the illegal immigrant population. There were always people coming in. I could always continue to fill the labor pool with those people. But now that we don't have those people to replace and to fill our hotel labor force, now I just have to actually recruit Americans to do those jobs, and I have to pay them more money. And it occurred to me, first of all, there were two really sort of fundamental insights that I had about this moment. The first is this guy was really frustrated. One of the wealthiest people in the world, of course, that he had to pay his people more money, working and middle-class people a better wage so that they could live their lives. I just thought, this is such a ridiculous way to think about your own workers and your own people. The second thing is that it made it clear how sometimes what's framed as compassion for illegal immigration is just raw, cynical economic self-interest from our economic elites. That what he saw is that a tight border was bad for his bottom line. If he couldn't import low-wage immigration or low-wage immigrants into his hotel workforce, then he was going to have to pay more people money, and he didn't like that. And my wife, who always asks me, you seem to, the more you go to these events, the more that you get frustrated with these people. I'm always curious why. And she sat at that dinner with me and sort of listened to this, with her jaw on the floor. And then afterwards said, yeah, I can understand why you don't like these people very much.
Well, it's such a contrast. It flashes my mind back to Henry Ford. When Henry Ford was first making the automobile, he realized very few of my workers could afford an automobile. So he said, you know what? If I'm going to create a mass market automobile for America, I got to pay these guys more. I got to pay them more, and I got to make a cheaper car, because the combination of me paying better wages and making a cheaper car is going to allow my type of worker to go buy my type of car. And in the end, so that's an enlightened concept of self-interest, whereas it appears that the dude you're talking about is sort of the bad CEO, because this guy, first of all, cares nothing about him. He cares nothing about being in America, having all the opportunities America provides. He's perfectly willing to screw over his fellow American if he can get an elite. So he's willing to break the law, and he's also willing to undercut American wages
Yep.
all because he wants to be, as you say, even richer than he already is.
Yeah, that's a really smart point. And one of the things that Peter Thiel, the great investor and social commentator, said is that in the 1950s, you could make a really good argument that what was good for GM is good for America. It's not totally true that in the 2020s, what's good for Google is good for America, because so many of our business class, they've divorced their sense of economic self-interest from the broader community and the broader nation state. Right? Like you said, this enlightened sense of self-interest that recognized that Henry Ford is going to get a lot wealthier if his workers are doing well, if his nation is doing well. You have a lot of these modern business elites who don't see any difference between their own country and China, who don't really care about their own communities in the same way, who don't care about their workers in the same way. And I unfortunately think that we're getting to a point where so many of these multinationals care more about other people, care more about people outside of their own borders, care more about foreign governments that don't share our values as Americans, that we're in a really dangerous period where we can't always, as conservatives, count on the business interests of folks anymore. I think, by the way, this is a big reason why our corporations have become so woke, is because if they were invested in their own workers, invested in their own communities, if they cared more about the American nation, then they would recognize that going off in this hyper woke anti-American direction would be bad for their bottom line. But if they're increasingly more invested in foreign labor and increasingly more invested in foreign governments, that starts to really break the chain between the nation state on the one hand and the businesses that help build the nation on the other hand.
Now, are we seeing a movement away from this idea that we belong to a country? I say this because nationalism, the idea that we love our country, is not a phenomenon that goes back thousands of years. It's a phenomenon that goes back hundreds of years, when suddenly people began to feel, I'm an Italian, I'm a Frenchman, I'm an American, and they saw a commonality among your fellow citizens. I think even today it's true that if Americans see each other on the Champs-Élysées or in some place in Korea, they immediately recognize each other. So they've got habits and mores in common. But it could also be that, at least as far as these CEOs are concerned, that they are now identifying more with their racial identity. I have white privilege, as you say, they're woke, they're into all that. But you ask them about, the American flag, the American anthem, the kind of insignia of American membership, and it doesn't seem to resonate with them. Or at least they're perfectly willing to have their employees spurn the flag or take a knee for the anthem. They're against the country, even though they're in favor of all these other forms of identity, which apparently have come to center stage.
Yeah, I really hope that we're not going down that pathway, because I think it's a very dangerous place for us to go. And I think one of the lessons of the past few hundred years of history is that this multi-ethnic sense of American nationhood that we've had, it really works for us. You mentioned I'm married to an Indian immigrant. We've always felt like this country belongs to us and like we belong to the country. That's a very important and a very unifying thing. But when you start to organize your identity around other things, then it can be a little bit more precarious. I think a healthy way to organize your identity is around a common faith, a common religion. But when you start to organize your identity around your racial or ethnic heritage or other things, then it can lead to a dark and dangerous place. And I think increasingly our corporations are actually encouraging us to divide ourselves by racial lines, by ethnic lines. I think it maybe makes them a little bit more powerful, because if we're divided against each other, they have a little bit more say in our society. But I think it's really bad for a sense of common American nationhood in the society that we have in the 21st century. And an important thing, of course, is I think these businesses, at the end of the day, are being incredibly short-sighted. Do they really think that the Chinese nation state, a hyper-ethnic, effectively a fascist society, is going to be better for Amazon, for Google, for Apple, for Facebook over the long term? It maybe will help them juice their short-term profits. It maybe will provide them a few million slaves to work in the production of their goods. But over the long term, I think we all need to recognize that basic American values, self-respect, devotion to our country, respect for one another, respect for people's differences, if those things are not, at the end of the day, the sort of thing that you can just kind of fritter away and expect them to exist in another country. If you want to have freedom of conscience, freedom to operate your business the way you want to, the United States of America is still the best place to do it. And I hope eventually these corporations realize that.